You've been lied to about revolutions. When you hear the French Revolution, you probably imagine liberty, equality, fraternity, and a clean, decisive end for its villains under the swift blade of the guillotine. But here's the twist. Maximilien Robespierre, the man once called the incorruptible, didn't get the clean execution he demanded for thousands of others. His final hours were a grotesque theater of humiliation, pain, and blood, far worse than most people realize. Imagine this: the man who orchestrated mass purges, who silenced enemies with a single nod toward the guillotine, ended up crawling across a floor, half dead, with his jaw blown off, unable to speak, begging only with his eyes. His execution wasn't a dignified end. It was a living nightmare, stretched out for everyone to see. And here's the kicker. His downfall wasn't just personal. It was France itself devouring the monster it had created. His death was the revolution turning cannibal. In this film, we're going to peel back the sanitized history books and reveal the 7 escalating levels of horror in Robespierre's fall, from betrayal and mutilation to public torture disguised as justice. By the end, you'll see why this was less an execution and more a ritual of collective vengeance. Because sometimes history isn't noble, it's cruel, messy, and shockingly human. They called him l'incorruptible, a man so pure, so devoted to virtue, that even his enemies whispered the name with a strange mix of respect and dread. Maximilien Robespierre, son of a failed lawyer, rose from obscurity not with a sword, but with words. In a revolution drenched in blood and chaos, he preached morality. He demanded purity. He promised a France reborn, scrubbed clean of corruption. And yet, beneath the halo of virtue, he became the single most terrifying figure of the revolution, orchestrating death with the calm precision of a surgeon. It's one of history's greatest ironies. The man who called himself a defender of liberty presided over a regime where freedom meant silence and dissent meant the guillotine. While others sought power through wealth, Robespierre's power was stranger, colder. He held himself up as a prophet of virtue, above reproach, untouchable, and that untouchability made him lethal. Because when you believe yourself the embodiment of morality, every rival becomes not just an opponent, but an enemy of truth itself. Under his watch, the revolution became less a fight against tyranny and more a holy war for purity. The Reign of Terror, 40,000 executed, tens of thousands more jailed in squalid prisons, wasn't chaos. It was order, his order, cloaked in the language of justice. Judges delivered sentences in minutes. Heads fell like clockwork. The streets of Paris ran red, not because of mobs, but because Robespierre's voice demanded it. And his voice, that was his real weapon. Thin, sharp, relentless. He wasn't a general on the battlefield. He wasn't a man of charm in salons. He was a preacher, and every speech was a sermon. His words could move the convention like a storm. And when he named someone as a traitor, that person was already dead. Their body just hadn't caught up yet. He was untouchable because he had made himself the revolution's conscience. And who could argue with conscience? When Robespierre spoke of virtue, he spoke as if he alone carried its flame. To challenge him was to side with corruption, with monarchy, with treason itself. In this way, Robespierre silenced France. The sound of liberty was drowned beneath the mechanical chop of the guillotine. Yet here lies the hidden truth. The so-called incorruptible was not above corruption. He was consumed by fear, suspicion, and a paranoia that grew more ravenous with every victory. His enemies were not just aristocrats. They became his own allies, friends who had raised him to power. One year found themselves condemned as traitors the next. Even Georges Danton, once his ally, marched to the guillotine on Robespierre's orders. France was not ruled by a man. It was ruled by a shadow, a spectre of incorruptible morality that demanded constant sacrifice. The people obeyed because they feared, but they also obeyed because they believed. And that belief, that a man could stand above corruption, above temptation, was Robespierre's most dangerous weapon. But absolute virtue comes at a price. When you place yourself above humanity, you leave no room for failure, no space for compromise, no escape from the terror you create. Robespierre became untouchable, not because he was pure, but because he convinced France that purity itself had found a voice in him. And yet, the higher he climbed, the more fragile his perch became. Because a prophet of virtue can only stand while others believe. And when that belief shatters, the fall is merciless. Robespierre, the man who silenced France with his sermons of morality, would soon discover what happens when silence comes for him. Paris, July 27, 1794. The air was thick with fear and sweat. Inside the Hôtel de Ville, Maximilien Robespierre sat cornered like a beast in a cage. Only hours earlier he had stood before the convention, attempting one of his signature thunderous speeches. But this time, something snapped. His voice, the same voice that once commanded executions by the thousands, was drowned out by Boos jeers and a rising roar of defiance. For the first time, the incorruptible was silenced, not by death sentences, but by his own people. Now, barricaded in the city hall with a handful of loyalists, Robespierre faced the end. Soldiers stormed the building. Chaos exploded in the dark. Pistols raised, swords drawn, and in the frenzy came the moment that would seal his grotesque fate. A shot rang out. The bullet tore through his lower face. His jaw, his instrument of power, the weapon sharper than any blade, was blown apart in a mist of blood and shattered bone. Some whispered he had tried to kill himself. A final act of control, the last word of a man obsessed with destiny. Others claimed a soldier pulled the trigger, delivering vengeance before the trial could even begin. To this day, no one knows with certainty, but the truth hardly mattered. What mattered was the sight. Robespierre, the man of speeches, reduced to a gagging, blood-choked wreck. The irony was unbearable. Here was the man who had ruled through rhetoric, who sent friends and rivals alike to the guillotine with carefully measured phrases, now unable to form a single word. His jaw dangled, shattered, held in place only by torn flesh and desperation. Blood gushed down his neck, soaking the once pristine clothes of the revolutionary prophet. His body writhed, but his mouth, the mouth that once declared the revolution's morality, was nothing but ruin. Witnesses described him lying on the floor, eyes wide with horror, clutching at his face as if trying to hold himself together. The sound was worse than the sight. Groans, gurgles, the pathetic wheeze of a man once feared across France, now reduced to the sounds of a dying animal. And the humiliation didn't end with pain. Guards dragged him out like a broken carcass, his head lolling, his bandages hastily tied to keep his jaw from falling off completely. The soldiers didn't treat him like the incorruptible prophet of virtue. No. They mocked him, they jeered, they paraded him like a trophy. To them, he wasn't a leader anymore. He was meat. Imagine it, the architect of the terror, who had forced thousands to mount the scaffold with dignity stripped away, now being hauled through the streets of Paris, unable even to beg for mercy. He couldn't defend himself, couldn't justify himself, couldn't deliver the final speech that every revolutionary dreamed of. He had condemned men like Danton for corruption, silencing them with a flick of his tongue. Now his tongue flopped uselessly in a pool of blood. This was more than injury. It was poetic mutilation. The revolution had struck Robespierre exactly where he lived. His mouth, his identity was annihilated, not by exile or assassination, but by the destruction of the very tool that made him terrifying. And yet, the cruelty had only just begun. The bullet hadn't killed him. It had trapped him. He was alive, conscious, and fully aware of every humiliation to come. His eyes darted around wildly, filled with a silent terror more eloquent than any speech. He was no longer the incorruptible. He was the mute spectacle of suffering, dragged into history not as a martyr, but as a grotesque warning. The man who once decided the fate of a nation with his words would spend his last hours in silence. No defense, no legacy carved in rhetoric, just the stench of blood, the rattle of his breath, and the sound of laughter from those who had once feared him. If Robespierre had hoped to die swiftly, with the dignity of control, that hope was gone. His silence was not peace, it was mockery. His suffering became public entertainment, the perfect reversal of his years of power. But if you thought the shattering of his jaw was the ultimate humiliation, just wait until the parade began. Dawn broke over Paris with a cruel kind of theater. The city that had once cheered for liberty was about to watch its former master dragged through its streets like a sacrificial animal. Robespierre did not walk. He couldn't. He was hauled out of the Hôtel de Ville on a blood-soaked mattress, his shattered jaw tied up with filthy bandages, his face the color of chalk. This was not a trial yet. This was transport. But in revolutionary France, even the journey to the tribunal became a performance. The carriages rolled slowly, deliberately, through the heart of the capital. And in them sat not just Robespierre but 21 of his allies, the so-called architects of the terror, now reduced to twitching, bloodied wrecks. What should have been private misery was transformed into public theater. Crowds gathered at every street corner, craning their necks for a glimpse of the dying prophet of virtue. Some spat at him, some laughed, mocking his silence with grotesque pantomimes, pretending to clutch their throats and whimper. Others hurled rotten food, but many just stared, frozen, fascinated, watching the man who once terrified France reduced to a mute, mutilated shadow. And here lies the dark irony. The revolution that had promised dignity, equality, and the protection of the people's honor had now become indistinguishable from the very old regime it claimed to overthrow. The parading of broken men through jeering crowds was not liberty, it was ritual humiliation, closer to the medieval pillory than to the Enlightenment. What had been a machine for justice had become a circus for vengeance. Think about it. Thousands had once been driven through these same streets toward the guillotine, and Robespierre had ensured that their last moments were carefully stage-managed. Swift trials, quick executions, all in the name of virtue, and yet here he was, denied even the speed of anonymity. He was a spectacle. He was content. His jaw dangled grotesquely beneath the bandages, his eyes rolling with terror, lips trembling as though trying to speak, but only bloody gurgles escaped. He who once silenced men with speeches now produced only the pitiful noises of the dying. The people who once listened in silence to his oratory now howled with laughter at his collapse. Every bump of the carriage was another stab of pain. Every shout from the mob was another nail in his coffin. And all around him were the faces of his allies, equally broken, equally despised. They had once moved like kings through the convention, now they slumped together like criminals, bound for a trial that was already decided. It's easy to imagine the cruelty ending there. The blood loss, the humiliation, the spectacle that should have been enough. But revolutions never end in enough. They demand escalation. They feed on suffering, and Robespierre's silence only made the hunger worse. The crowd wanted more than his body. They wanted his degradation paraded, his collapse immortalized. This was not simply punishment. It was revenge performed for an audience, a mob that had once cowered under his reign, now relishing his powerlessness. Like a fallen celebrity dragged across social media scandals today, Robespierre's destruction was made into a spectacle for the masses. Only this spectacle was drenched in real blood, not metaphorical scandal. His ride through Paris was the death of the incorruptible long before the guillotine touched his neck. His body was broken, his dignity stripped, and his silence screamed louder than any speech. But the mob wasn't satisfied with seeing him broken. They wanted him displayed. The trial wasn't a trial at all. It was theater. Dragged into the revolutionary tribunal, Robespierre was a grotesque parody of the man he once was. His head swaddled in filthy, blood-soaked bandages, his face mangled beyond recognition, his jaw barely hanging on. He didn't look like a prophet of virtue anymore. He looked like carrion, And that was precisely how they wanted him. The crowd expected to see the mighty incorruptible reduced to something less than human. They wanted him mute, mutilated, humiliated, and that's exactly what they got. There was no jury to convince, no lawyers to argue, no space for a defense. In fact, Robespierre could not have defended himself even if given the chance. His voice, the voice that had once dictated the fate of France, was gone, replaced by bubbling groans and bloody wheezes. Imagine the irony. The man who sent thousands to their deaths with carefully sculpted words was now unable to form a single sentence. He was condemned not just by decree, but by silence. The tribunal read out charges in the mechanical tone of bureaucratic vengeance, treason, tyranny, conspiracy. The words hardly mattered. Everyone in that room knew the verdict long before it was read. This wasn't about justice. It was about vengeance dressed up in paperwork. Think of it like a show trial. In the age of dictatorships, Stalin's purges, Mao's cultural tribunals, North Korea's staged confessions. The accused are dragged forward, broken, forced to serve as examples. Their guilt is already scripted. Their silence is their final testimony. The audience doesn't come for justice. They come for the performance of justice. And that's exactly what Robespierre became, a living exhibit of downfall. The atmosphere inside the hall was electric, not with tension, but with a sick exhilaration. Deputies and judges, who had once cowered under his gaze, now smirked openly, savoring the sight of the incorruptible writhing like a wounded dog. Every bandage, every bloodstain, every twitch of his face was proof that the revolution had turned its blade inward. This wasn't a courtroom, it was a circus. When the guilty verdict was announced swiftly, almost casually, there were no gasps of shock, only applause. The very hall where Robespierre had orchestrated so many deaths now reverberated with cheers for his own destruction. He had ruled with words, but words no longer mattered. The revolution spoke now only through blood. And so, his sentence was set, death by guillotine. Quick, efficient, merciful, at least in theory. But there was nothing merciful about what followed. For Robespierre's broken body wasn't taken swiftly to the blade. No, he was paraded once again through Paris, alongside his allies, the blood from his ruined jaw dripping onto the streets as the crowd howled for more. Each second was a reminder that the revolution's justice was less about fairness and more about feeding the public's appetite for spectacle. Witnesses wrote of the grotesque scene. Robespierre slumped, his face still wrapped in crusted linen, his eyes glassy but awake. Some described him as pale as a corpse. Others swore his gaze still burned with defiance, but all agreed he was suffering. The silence of his broken mouth seemed louder than any plea for mercy could have been. And this was the cruel genius of his downfall. They hadn't just silenced him. They had weaponized his silence, turning it into a spectacle greater than any speech. The man who once dictated the fates of others could not dictate his own. By the time he reached the Place de la Révolution, the mob was no longer content to see him simply condemned. They wanted him destroyed. The air rang with screams, laughter, jeers. The revolution had promised to end the cruelty of kings, but in this moment it had become something darker, an endless carnival of blood. And the guillotine waited at the center, gleaming in the sun like a promise. But what the crowd didn't yet know was that even this, the supposedly swift mercy of the blade, would fail to grant him dignity. And then came the guillotine, but not the quick death you've been told. The guillotine was supposed to be merciful. That was its entire invention. A clean mechanical end, the blade falling swift and sure, severing head from body in a single instant. Enlightenment justice, they called it. Humane, rational, even democratic. No more botched hangings, no more burning alive, no more medieval tortures. The guillotine was meant to spare a condemned soul the spectacle of prolonged agony. But for Maximilien Robespierre, the guillotine betrayed its promise. Dragged to the scaffold, his body sagged under the hands of the executioner. The crowd's roar was deafening, yet what silenced them for a moment was the sight of his bandaged face. His jaw, grotesquely shattered, was still bound in filthy cloth. The executioner had one final job: remove the bandages before the blade fell. And so, in front of thousands, the linen was torn away. Witnesses wrote that Robespierre screamed, not words, just an unholy shriek, muffled and gurgling through his ruined mouth. His jaw split open again, dangling obscenely as blood poured down his chest. The sound was so hideous, so inhuman, that the crowd erupted, not in silence, not in pity, but in savage, roaring laughter. This was not mercy. This was cruelty, given a stage. The guillotine, designed to make death quick and clean, became a weapon of humiliation. Every second before the blade fell was agony stretched like a spectacle, each moment twisting the knife of irony deeper. The man who had demanded so many executions in the name of virtue was now reduced to an animal shrieking before the blade. Some said his eyes bulged with fury, others with despair. One witness claimed they locked onto the crowd as though to curse them. But the truth is simpler. His eyes begged, silently, for the end. The incorruptible, stripped of speech, stripped of dignity, wanted nothing more than release. The drum roll thundered. The blade was raised, and then at last the guillotine delivered its verdict. His head fell, his eyes staring, his broken jaw grotesquely askew, blood staining the wood. The crowd howled like spectators at a festival. So much for the humane revolution. What was supposed to be a symbol of progress revealed itself instead as a machine of mockery. The guillotine wasn't just about ending lives, it was about displaying them, performing them, turning death into public theater. And Robespierre's execution, far from being the clean efficiency he had promised France, became the most grotesque advertisement of all. That even in death, the revolution could not resist cruelty. But Robespierre's fate was not unique. He was just the most infamous, because what followed revealed the true sickness of the revolution, its hunger not just to kill its enemies, but to consume itself. And soon the blade would fall on his allies too. And if history teaches anything, it's this: monsters rarely stay buried.